There are love stories that begin with fireworks, and then there are the dangerous ones, the ones that begin in silence, with a simple hello in the office kitchen, with a glance that lasts 1 second longer than it should, with a feeling you don't allow yourself to name, and yet it's already there, quiet, risky, alive. No one ever warns you that work can become the place where a heart breaks. Officially, it's just desks, screens, deadlines, meetings. But unofficially, it's where you spend most of your life, where you learn people's voices without seeing their faces, where you notice when someone is sad, even though everyone pretends they're fine. And sometimes, that's exactly where feelings are born, feelings that were never part of the plan. At first, it was nothing, just a colleague, just another person in an open office, the same coffee machine, the same hallways, the same Mondays. But somewhere between reports and short conversations, small details appeared. A smile when our eyes met, laughter that sounded different than it did with others, and that strange feeling that the day felt lighter simply because you knew they would be there. For a long time, it wasn't love. It was curiosity, or maybe a quiet illusion, a thought that appeared unexpectedly and was pushed away just as fast. No, it's just work. No, it's just my imagination. No, don't complicate this. But the heart doesn't listen to logic. It collects moments. It observes. It waits. There were mornings when walking into work came with a soft sense of excitement, not because of tasks or responsibilities, but because of the chance to see them, because of a few minutes of conversation that meant nothing, and yet became the most important part of the day, because of the way their voice changed when it was just the two of you, because of a silence that felt comfortable instead of awkward. Then came the messages. At first, strictly about work. Short questions, fast replies, later a bit of humor, then something more personal, something that no longer had anything to do with responsibilities. Evening messages, morning, good mornings, and that quiet realization that a line had been crossed without either of you saying it out loud. A workplace romance is never officially announced. It simply happens. One day, you realize this person matters to you more than they should, that their opinion carries more weight than anyone else's, that their mood affects yours, that if they're hurting, you feel it too, even without knowing why. The first touch happened by accident, or at least that's what you both pretended. Hands met for too long, and no one pulled away. There was that second when time seemed to pause and something clicked inside you. A silent understanding. This was no longer innocent. From that moment on, everything intensified. Conversations grew deeper. Laughter became closer. Glances more honest. And along with it came fear. Because you both knew it was dangerous. Work, people around you, reputation, consequences. But the more you tried to keep your distance, the stronger the pull became. The first date was never called a date. It was just coffee after work. No expectations, no pressure. At least, that's what the mind said. But the heart already knew. The voice trembled just a little more. The laughter was too loud. The eyes searched for each other too often. That evening, you went home feeling both light and heavy. Light because you were happy. Heavy because you knew. You had stepped into a story that could end in pain. But at the time, it felt distant, almost unreal. Because at the beginning, every story feels different. Like this one might escape the rules. The following weeks felt like living between two worlds. The official one at work, where you pretended nothing was happening. And the hidden one, inside looks, messages, brief moments away from watching eyes. Every meeting became a silent agreement. Every goodbye turned into waiting. There were moments when it felt like too much, when the risk seemed greater than the feelings, when stopping now felt like the smartest option. But then they smiled, or sent one sentence that hit straight into your chest, and every rational decision collapsed. Love at work has a specific taste, sharper, more intense, more dangerous. Every day becomes a stage where you must act, hide, control yourself. And somehow, that makes it burn even stronger. What's forbidden often feels more powerful. At that time, you didn't know how it would end. You didn't know the price this feeling would demand. You didn't know that one day, the same hallways that now felt warm would turn cold. That the same coffee machine would remind you not of the beginning, but of the end. You were just living the moment and believing. Because in the beginning, love always feels stronger than consequences, and hope is always louder than fear. At first, the happiness felt effortless, almost weightless, like something you didn't have to explain or defend. It lived quietly between stolen glances and unfinished sentences. It didn't ask questions. It didn't demand clarity. It simply existed. And for a while, that was enough. Days at work began to feel different. Time moved strangely. Meetings dragged when they weren't there and passed too quickly when they were sitting across from you, pretending to be just another colleague. You learned to read their body language, the way they leaned in when interested, the way their eyes softened when they looked at you, the way their smile appeared before they even realized they were smiling. There was a thrill in the secrecy, not because you wanted to deceive anyone, but because the world you shared felt like it belonged only to the two of you, a private frequency no one else could hear. Every small moment felt amplified. A shared joke during a serious meeting, a message sent under the table, a brush of fingers that looked accidental to everyone else but meant everything to you. Outside of work, the connection deepened. Conversations stretched late into the night. You spoke about childhoods, fears, past relationships, dreams that had never been said out loud before. You began to recognize pieces of yourself in them, and that recognition created comfort. Dangerous comfort. There were moments when you caught yourself imagining a future. Not deliberately. It just slipped in. A thought of how weekends might look, how mornings could feel, how this person fit too easily into spaces you hadn't intended to open. Each time you tried to pull back, remind yourself of reality. But imagination has a way of ignoring warnings. Slowly, subtle changes appeared. Small enough to ignore at first. Replies that took longer. Smiles that didn't linger as they used to. Conversations that ended sooner than expected. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make you wonder if you were overthinking or sensing something real. You didn't want to be the first to ask. Asking would mean admitting how much you cared. And caring meant vulnerability. So instead, you watched. You analyzed tone. You reread messages. You searched for reassurance in moments that were never meant to carry that much weight. Work became complicated in a new way. You were still close, but something invisible had shifted. The ease was interrupted by hesitation. The laughter sometimes felt forced. And when others were around, the distance felt wider than before. It was confusing. Painfully confusing, because the connection hadn't disappeared, it had just changed its shape. You told yourself it was temporary, that everyone has phases, that stress explains everything, that feelings don't vanish overnight. Hope is very convincing when it wants to survive, but there was one moment you couldn't ignore. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even a conversation. It was a look that didn't find you the way it used to. A look that passed right through you as if you were no longer the person they searched for first. And something inside you quietly broke. From that moment on, doubt took root. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. You started questioning yourself. Maybe you misread everything. Maybe it meant more to you than it ever did to them. Maybe you imagined the depth because you needed it to be real. You tried to pull back emotionally, protect yourself, lower expectations. But the heart doesn't know how to retreat cleanly. It drags memories with it. it leaves parts behind. There were still good moments, and somehow those hurt the most, because they reignited hope just enough to keep you stuck. A warm message after a cold day, a shared laugh that felt like before, a moment alone that reminded you why you fell in the first place. That small hope refused to die. It whispered that this was just a phase, that closeness always returns, that love doesn't disappear so easily. And you listened, because letting go felt worse than waiting. But waiting has a cost. You began to feel tired, emotionally heavy, constantly alert. Every interaction became something to decode. Every silence felt personal. Every distance felt like rejection. And yet, you stayed. Because part of you believed that if you were patient enough, careful enough, understanding enough, things would go back to how they were. Work, once a neutral place, slowly became charged with emotion. The office felt louder. The hallways felt narrower. The coffee machine felt like a reminder of something you were losing but couldn't name out loud. You didn't talk about it with anyone. How could you? It wasn't official. There were no rules to explain, no labels to defend. Just feelings, messy, real, and invisible. And so you carried it alone. By the end of that phase, you were no longer just in love. You were attached. And attachment makes people hope even when the signs are telling them to stop. You didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the disappointment. Not the end, just the slow, quiet descent. Disappointment rarely arrives all at once. It seeps in, quietly, almost politely. It doesn't slam doors or raise its voice. It changes the temperature of the room and waits for you to notice. At first, you blamed yourself. That's usually how it starts. You wondered if you asked for too much, if you expected something that was never promised, if your feelings had grown faster than theirs, and now you were paying the price for it. Self-doubt is convincing when you're already emotionally invested. They were still kind, still respectful, and that made everything harder. Because if they had been cruel, detaching would have been easier. But kindness kept the door open just enough for hope to keep slipping through. Conversations became shorter, less layered, more practical. You noticed how often work slipped back into the center of every exchange, how personal topics were gently avoided, how silence started filling the spaces where curiosity used to live. You told yourself not to react, not to push, not to become too much. You learned how to swallow questions before they reached your mouth, how to smile when something inside you wanted to ask, "Where did I go wrong?" The imbalance became impossible to ignore. You cared more, you waited more, you adjusted more, and slowly, without meaning to, you started shrinking yourself to fit into the version of the connection they were willing to offer. There was a day when you realized you were no longer excited to go to work. Instead, you felt tense, alert, prepared for disappointment before it even happened. Your heart started bracing itself every morning, and that was new, painful, exhausting. You watched them laugh with others the way they used to laugh with you, watched their attention shift naturally, effortlessly, away from you, and you pretended it didn't hurt. Because admitting it hurt would mean admitting you were losing something that had never officially been yours. One afternoon, you almost asked. You rehearsed the words in your head. Something simple, something calm. But fear stopped you. Fear of the answer. Fear that asking would turn uncertainty into confirmation. And sometimes uncertainty feels safer than truth. So you waited. Waiting became a habit. Waiting for messages, waiting for moments alone, waiting for signs that you still mattered the same way. And each time you waited, you gave a little more of yourself away. There was one conversation that changed everything, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. You shared something personal, something vulnerable, and they responded kindly, but distantly. No curiosity, no follow-up. just a polite acknowledgement. That's when you understood, not with your mind, but with your body. That hollow feeling in your chest, that quiet drop in your stomach. Your body recognized loss before your mind was ready to name it. From then on, every interaction felt heavier. You started noticing the effort it took to maintain normalcy, the way you had to prepare yourself before seeing them, the way you replayed conversations afterward, searching for meaning that wasn't there anymore. You began to grieve something that was still technically alive. And that kind of grief is the most confusing, because you're mourning while still showing up, smiling while slowly breaking. At work, nothing changed on the surface. Projects moved forward, meetings continued, people laughed. But inside you, something fundamental had shifted. The place that once felt warm now felt fragile, unsafe. There were moments when you felt foolish, embarrassed by how deeply you had fallen, ashamed of how much space this person occupied in your thoughts. You asked yourself how you let it happen, how you missed the moment when hope turned into dependency. And yet, part of you still held on, because there were memories, because there was history, because walking away felt like erasing something meaningful, and because the heart is slow to accept endings that arrive without closure. You tried to create emotional distance. You replied slower. You spoke less. You avoided situations where you might be alone together. But every attempt at control reminded you of how little control you actually had. You weren't angry. Not yet. You were just deeply sad. And sadness has a way of draining color from everything else. Food tasted dull. Music felt heavier. Nights grew longer. And through it all, one small thought stayed alive. Maybe this is just another phase. Maybe closeness will return. Maybe I just need to be patient. That small hope didn't feel powerful anymore. It felt fragile, but it was still there. And as long as it existed, you couldn't fully let go. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't being hurt. It's accepting that the story you believed in is quietly ending without ever saying goodbye. There comes a moment when pretending starts to cost more than telling the truth. You don't decide it consciously. You just feel tired in a way sleep can't fix. Tired of guessing. Tired of hoping. Tired of carrying emotions that no longer have a place to land. That's when clarity begins to hurt. You started noticing patterns you once ignored. How you were always the one initiating. How silence had become normal. How effort now came from one side only. These weren't dramatic realizations. They were quiet, heavy, impossible to unsee once they appeared. Work turned into a test of endurance. Every shared space felt charged. You measured your reactions, your tone, your expressions. You didn't want to seem cold, but you couldn't afford to seem hopeful either. Balance became survival. There was a day when you overheard something you weren't meant to. A casual conversation, nothing cruel, nothing intentional, just enough information to confirm what your intuition had been whispering for weeks. They were moving on, emotionally at least. Your heart sank in a slow, controlled way. No panic, no shock, just a deep, sinking understanding, the kind that settles in your chest and stays there. You didn't confront them, not because you were weak, but because you already had your answer, and asking would only force them to say it out loud. Sometimes silence is the clearest response. From that point on, every interaction felt final, even if it looked normal. You realized you were watching the last version of something, the last casual conversation, the last shared laugh, the last moment of unspoken closeness. And endings like that don't announce themselves. They fade. You felt anger arrive quietly, not explosive, just steady. Anger at yourself for ignoring signs, for romanticizing uncertainty, for staying longer than your self-respect should have allowed. And that anger came with shame, because you knew better. You always had. You began pulling away for real this time, not as a strategy, not to provoke a reaction, but because your heart could no longer afford exposure. You needed distance like oxygen. They noticed, not immediately, but eventually. A question here, a look there, confusion in their eyes. And that confusion hurt more than indifference, because it meant they hadn't realized how much they had taken. You considered saying everything, laying it all out, explaining how deeply you had felt, how long you had waited, how much you had lost. But you stopped yourself. Not everyone deserves access to your vulnerability, especially those who didn't protect it when they had the chance. So you chose dignity over closure. Days passed. Work continued. And slowly, the emotional intensity dulled. Not because it stopped hurting, but because pain can't stay sharp forever. It either transforms or consumes you, and you refuse to be consumed. You started reclaiming small parts of yourself, your attention, your energy, your inner world. You stopped checking your phone so often, stopped reading into every tone, stopped waiting. But grief doesn't leave quietly. It revisits. It shows up in memories, in songs, in moments of silence. And every time it did, you reminded yourself, this wasn't a failure. It was an experience. You didn't lose because you cared. You lost because the care wasn't returned in the same measure. That truth stung, but it also grounded you. One morning you walked into work and realized something had changed. The weight was lighter, not gone, but manageable. You could breathe again without bracing yourself. You could exist in the same space without feeling exposed. And that's when you understood. Healing doesn't happen when pain disappears. It happens when pain stops controlling your behavior. You are no longer hoping. You are accepting. And acceptance is not peace, but it's the doorway to it. Acceptance didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with emptiness, a strange, unfamiliar quiet where intense emotion used to live. You had spent so long thinking, feeling, analyzing, waiting, that when it stopped, you didn't know what to do with the space it left behind. At work, you functioned. You spoke when needed. You smiled when expected. On the surface, everything looked normal. But inside, something felt muted, as if your emotional volume had been turned down without asking for permission. You noticed how little they occupied your thoughts now, not because they were gone, but because your mind was tired, exhausted from carrying a story that no longer had a future. And that exhaustion brought a different kind of sadness, quieter, deeper. There were moments when you missed the intensity, not the pain, but the feeling of being alive, of caring deeply about something. Loss doesn't just take people away. It takes versions of ourselves with them. You began questioning what the experience had changed in you. You realized you were more cautious now, more reserved, less willing to lean in without certainty. The innocence you once had, believing connection would naturally be mutual, had been replaced with awareness. And awareness is heavier than hope. Still, something surprising happened. Beneath the disappointment, you found strength. You had survived something that mattered. You hadn't numbed yourself or run away. You stayed present through confusion, rejection, and grief. And that mattered. The workplace slowly transformed back into just a workplace. Not entirely neutral, but no longer emotional territory. The hallways lost their charge. The coffee machine became just a machine again. And that normality, once impossible, now felt like progress. You stopped replaying conversations in your head, stopped imagining alternate endings, stopped asking what you could have done differently, because eventually you understood. Clarity doesn't come from answers. It comes from letting go of the questions. There were still moments of weakness, days when memories resurfaced unexpectedly, when you felt a quiet ache instead of sharp pain. But you learned how to sit with it, not fight it, not dramatize it. Just acknowledge it and move forward. One evening, you caught yourself smiling at something unrelated. A simple moment, a random thought. And that smile surprised you. Not because happiness returned, but because it returned without that story attached to it. That's when you realized something important. The connection didn't define your capacity to love. It simply revealed it. You had loved genuinely, without manipulation, without games, without conditions. And while it wasn't reciprocated in the same way, that didn't make it meaningless. It made it real. You began trusting yourself again, not in outcomes, but in your ability to handle them. You knew now that even if something broke your heart, it wouldn't destroy you. And that knowledge brought calm. Hope returned, but differently. Not loud, not desperate, just present. A quiet understanding that not every connection is meant to last, but every connection teaches something. You stopped wishing the story had ended differently, because if it had, you wouldn't be who you were now. More grounded, more aware, more careful with your heart, but not closed. And somewhere in that calm, you made peace with the idea that love doesn't always stay. Sometimes it passes through, leaves a mark, and moves on. That doesn't make it a mistake. It makes it a chapter. If you're still here, listening to this until the end, then this story touched something in you. And for that, I'm grateful. Because this was never just a story about a workplace romance. It was a story about attachment, about hope, about what happens when we allow ourselves to feel deeply in places that were never meant to hold that much emotion. It was about the quiet kind of heartbreak, the kind that doesn't leave visible scars, but changes how you see the world. By the end of it all, there was no dramatic ending, no confrontation, no final words that tied everything together neatly. Just distance, just understanding, just the slow realization that some connections don't end because they fail, but because they've taught us what they needed to teach. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but it softened. It became something you could carry without it defining you. And in that process, you learned something essential. Your ability to love was never the problem. It was the proof of your humanity. You walked away with more self-respect than regret, with more clarity than bitterness, and with a heart that, despite everything, stayed open, cautious, but alive. And maybe that's the real ending. Not closure, not revenge, not perfect understanding, but growth. Quiet, internal, undeniable growth. If this story felt familiar, if it reminded you of someone you once waited for, if you've ever loved quietly, deeply, and without guarantees, then know this. You weren't weak. You were brave. Thank you for spending your time here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing this story to exist inside your space, even for a moment. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about love, loss, and the spaces in between, you're warmly invited to subscribe. No pressure, just a quiet invitation. And wherever you are right now, I hope you're choosing yourself a little more than you did before. Thank you for listening.